right, folks, Dr. Kashey here in his processed food educational series. Buckle your seatbelts for this one, folks. It's a little bit longer, but covering an interesting topic. I know not too long ago, there are these headlines flying around how ultra-processed foods are making us all fat and killing us all. And it's talking about an experiment ran by Kevin Hall that was titled Ultra-Processed Diets Cause Excess Calorie Intake and Weight Gain in an Inpatient Randomized Controlled Trial of Ad Libitum Food Intake. That is a mouthful, but I'll get into what that means in a second and why he ran this study, what it means, and how I kind of interpreted some of the data that came from it. Now, the NIH Clinical Center, which stands for the National Institute of Health, they ran the first randomized controlled trial comparing two different diets. Okay, diet number one, which is an ultra-processed food product diet, and diet number two, whole foods and culinary ingredients, okay? Now, if you were to provide people with exposure to these foods in a controlled setting, what would happen? 20 volunteers came in and stayed in the lab for 28 days straight without leaving, and scientists measured every damn thing they ate, among a lot of other things, for the duration of the experiment. Scientists split the group up to 20 volunteers, two groups of 10, if I remember correctly, and one group ate the whole food diet for 14 days before swapping to the ultra-processed diet for 14 days, and the other group ate the ultra-processed diet for 14 days before swapping to the whole food diet for 14 days. Now, for the question, eating as much or as little as they want, was there any difference in calorie intake? Now, most of the opponents of processed foods will point their fingers at salt, sugar, and fat. We had this discussion many times over. And to make sure that is controlled, the scientists match for those components in both diets. The ultra-processed foods also have less fiber, so they match the fiber for good measure as well. Now, volunteers had 3 meals a day and unlimited access to snacks. They tracked body weight throughout, but the volunteers had no idea how much they weighed. They were blinded to it, and they also basically walk around in scrubs, so they wouldn't notice if the clothes that they did have weren't fitting as good, which may change their behavior in the experiment. They also wore continuous glucose monitors, but they couldn't see what those numbers were. And here's where things start to get spicy. Volunteers had access to foods that were matched for sugar, matched for salt, matched for fiber, and matched for protein on the two diets, and there was an average of 508 calories per day difference between the two diets. Volunteers ate more of the ultra-processed foods, or more calories from the ultra-processed foods, I guess is more fair. Protein intake was pretty much identical between the two diets. The difference was almost entirely carbohydrate and fat. They also ate more salt, but salt doesn't have any more calories, so I don't really care about that right now. There's 6 interesting points. Okay, so that was the fancy endpoint. People overate ultra-processed foods. Okay, this is exciting. Most people are like, yeah, okay, whatever, we already knew this, all right. But there's 6 interesting points to this, to me, okay? Point number 1, during the trial, scientists surveyed the volunteers on how hungry they were, how full they were, how satisfied they were with the meals, their eating capacity, how pleasant the volunteers found the food, if it was foreign or not, things of that nature. And there was no reasonable difference with any of those subjective measures, which I think is super interesting. One option is that people would find the ultra-processed food tastier. And again, when things taste better, you would eat more. But they didn't rate the food any tastier or more pleasant than the other diet. And how and when you ask these questions does matter, but I do think that data point is encouraging. It gives credence to small changes day to day, compounding to large changes later in terms of swapping out food choices in an uncontrolled environment, which is what a lot of fitness professionals try to encourage, okay? Now, point number 2, scientists actually secretly measured how fast the volunteers were eating. Now, they ate their ultra-processed meals faster, and this is a huge teachable moment for health professionals everywhere, that self-awareness is key. And I'll talk more about this point in point number 4. Now, in point number 3, volunteers in the processed food section of the study, it should be no surprise that they gained weight during that component of the experiment. And those same subjects, when they swapped back to the whole food diet, they lost that weight again. Now, everyone needs to perk their ears up now, because this is the biggest nugget, I think, from the entire project. The average subject overate around 500 calories. Average. When you look at the individual data points, the differences in how much people overate was comical. One of the people in the processed food group, they overate nearly 2,000 calories every day. That's enough to account for more than half of the calorie overages in all 20 subjects for one single person. Talk about skewing data, folks. Some people didn't overeat at all, some people barely overate, an outlier or two completely threw off the averages, and this does lend perspective in terms of inter-individual responses, okay? Which are a totally different thing, but something to keep in mind. One of the struggles of running experiments like this is that it's impossible to blind it. In other words, you know if you're eating whole food versus processed foods. And for that reason, it's impossible to unbias ad libitum behavior, which will end up skewing the data to some extent. Now, scientists did tell the subjects they could eat as much as they wanted. The issue is that it's impossible to blind the subjects to what type of diet they were consuming, which then means preconceived notions and biases can impact how much more or little they would eat. But again, that's just something to consider. Now, this does mean it's possible to purposefully overeat or undereat on either of the diets. Is it likely to happen? Maybe. Are those likely to be outliers? Yeah. Do outliers skew the data for everyone else? Yeah, they do. All right. Now, point number 4, the biochemical values do tell an interesting story. Now, during the ultra-processed phases, the full hormones were lower and the hungry hormones were higher. Enough to make a practical difference? I don't know. It's just an interesting data point. Do we know why? Not really. At least I don't. People can guess, but that's all it is. Okay? My best guess as a biochemist is that it has more to do with the physicality of the food than the nutrient content per se. Now, ultra-processed food is more likely to be softer, easier to eat, more accessible to the GI tract. When you decrease fiber and food bulk, you may alter the GI signaling per unit calorie. And this is with 100% ultra-processed food diet, keep that in mind. Will that translate to a typical person's diet that's partially whole foods and partially processed foods? Who knows? Now, this is likely additive to point number 2 regarding the speed of consumption. If it's easier to eat, maybe that's why they ate it faster. And if they ate it faster, maybe the brain-gut signaling was off and you overeat by the time that connection was made. Who knows, right? Since there's a delay between the stomach signaling the brain that, hey, I'm full, it's possible that by the time the signal had occurred, the chances of overeating calories during that time would be greater. Less processed foods are literally and figuratively more complicated to eat. More utensils, more chewing, greater food volume. They're less convenient to prepare. And these things may contribute to the satiety response of a meal. Okay? Now, point number 5, scientists matched fiber content between the 2 diets, okay? In the whole food diet, the fiber was in the food. In the ultra-processed food diet, the fiber was in their beverages, something very important to keep in mind. And this has strong mechanical digestion considerations. Fiber in food makes a much bigger difference than fiber in beverages. It just doesn't act the same way, okay? Think of it this way. You need eggs, flour, sugar, and butter to make a cake. You mix it, you bake it, and the end product is physically different than the components that make up the cake. If you ate all the ingredients to a cake, it doesn't turn into a cake in your belly. It does not smell, taste, digest, or satisfy in the same way, okay? And matching the diets for fiber on paper scratches the scientist's itch, but I fear it has little to no practical translation, right? One group had it all in their water and another group had it in their food. I just don't see that translating the same way. Who knows? I could be very wrong, but time will tell. Okay, point number 6. Last but not least, there's the so-called protein leverage hypothesis. And in short, this is the idea that humans and other animals, they may eat foods to hit a target protein value, whatever that may be for them. And since processed foods have a little less protein per calorie than whole foods, one possible explanation is that people may overeat their processed foods until they get enough protein in. And this is where things get a little tricky. So even though the protein content of the 2 diets were more or less matched, okay, subjects still had the option to eat or not eat the foods that were presented. And so it's possible that the subjects were just overeating the food options that had fewer calories in them and then making up for their protein that way. And since both groups had the same amount of daily protein when they measured everything at the end of the day, this actually can account for, a substantial percentage of that overeating effect size, okay? So the conclusion for this is that the reality is that this phenomenon is multifactorial and complex. Yes, chances are people are overeating ultra-processed foods, and it's probably a combination of all these points and some other points that have yet to be discovered. Because of this inter-individual variability associated with it, it's impossible to predict the psychological or biological indicators to figure out who's more likely to overeat and who isn't, at least right now to the best of my knowledge. And this is exactly why scientists run multiple experiments multiple times. 20 people is obviously misrepresentative of a population. However, it's an amazing start and some interesting questions do get raised. Running an experiment like this with more people helps us understand the effect, and if it translates to a larger population, then it will gain more traction in terms of what are some actionables. Now, right now, when you see these things floating around online, you see headlines that say, people overeat junk food, and everyone says, duh, right? Duh. But that doesn't help anyone. It ignores the how, what, when, where, and why. Removing the outliers, it's reasonable to say that people may overeat junk food, even if it's a little bit, and this also assumes that the person is eating 100% ultra-processed food. And even though that data may be unsurprising, okay, there's still little to no evidence pointing to why it happens. People can guess all day long, but we still don't know. And another key issue that does need resolving is whether or not the altered processed foods, okay, can be reformulated again to mitigate the potential effects on engendering a hypercaloric diet, right? So can we change the way ultra-processed foods are made to make it so people are less likely to overconsume them, leading to potential health risks, I suppose. And we have to understand the mechanism of why people are overeating them to begin with, which again, a lot of people have a lot of different ideas, but nothing has been substantiated. Okay, one thing that we can say to some degree of certainty is that salt, sugar, and fat are not likely the culprit for overeating, which is super interesting, okay? Scientists match those nutrients between the diets, and in a diagnosis by exclusion in terms of why people are more likely to overeat ultra-processed foods, I think it's a decent first step. So I hope you found that valuable. I think that was kind of a landmark study that will hopefully over the next probably 20 years end up influencing public policy in a very strong way that will end up benefiting the health of everybody.